Attention. Uncensored story is posted in the comments. When I walked through the door, time seemed to slow down, as if the air also wanted to observe that scene with me. He was sitting on the sofa, next to my father, his posture firm, almost ceremonial, and he looked up at the exact moment I entered. His gaze met mine and remained there, intense, still, as if he recognized me even before knowing my name. "Hi, son," said my father, in his usual warm, familiar voice. "This is Frederico, an old friend." I approached, feeling something strange in my chest, a mixture of curiosity and something else that was harder to name. I extended my hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Frederico. I'm Brian." He held my hand firmly, a grip that lasted a second longer than protocol, as if he wanted to measure something invisible between us. "So you're the one who lives abroad," he said, with a slight smile on his lips. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Brian. Your father has always spoken highly of you." And in that simple room filled with memories and antique furniture, I had the strange feeling that this encounter, so ordinary at first glance, carried with it the silent weight of something that was just beginning. I sat down on the sofa, settling in as if returning to a familiar place, and soon the conversation flowed effortlessly, the kind that arises naturally when time is generous. There were three of us there, me, my father, and Frederico, connected by stories that crossed between the past and the present. The conversation flowed easily. We talked about travel, work, how the world seemed to have changed too quickly. At 25, I had always enjoyed listening more than talking too much. There was something about older people that attracted me. Their calmness, their experience, their way of telling things without haste, like someone who has learned that not everything needs to be said at once. Frederico spoke with a confident, unhurried voice. He was the same age as my father, 46, and carried in the way he sat, crossed his hands, and looked while listening, that quiet authority of someone who had lived a long life. At times, I found myself paying more attention to him than to the conversation itself, observing his simple gestures, his restrained smile, his attentive gaze that occasionally met mine. My father seemed at ease, happy to see us there, sharing that late afternoon as if it were just another day. But for me it wasn't. There was something different in the air, something subtle, almost imperceptible, like when you feel a story beginning before you even understand why. And there, sitting between them, I realized that certain conversations are not just for passing the time they serve, to open paths that, until then, no one knew existed. But before I continue, let me introduce myself as they did in the old days, calmly and truthfully. My name is Brian. I'm 25 years old. When I was 17, my parents decided that the world needed to pass through me before life settled me down for good. They sent me out of the country on an exchange program, one of those that seem simple on paper but require courage in the heart. At first, it was difficult. Everything was strange. The language, the customs, the silence of the rented rooms, the absence of the smell of my parents' house. There were nights when I wondered if it had been the right decision, if it wasn't too early to learn to feel homesick. But time, that old patient master, did what it always does. Over the months, I got used to it. Then I started to like it. And when I realized it, that distant place was no longer just a destination, it had become part of me. The exchange ended, but I stayed. I built a routine, made a life for myself, learned to walk alone without leaving my origins behind. And whenever I could, I went back. I returned to see my parents, sit at the old table, hear the same stories repeated, feel that, despite everything, there were things that never changed. It was one of those returns that now had me sitting there, on that sofa, between my father and Frederico, not yet knowing that some stories don't begin when we leave. They begin precisely when we return. At one point, while we were talking, my father got up and said he was going to the kitchen to get some coffee. The sound of his footsteps receding broke something invisible in the air, and suddenly Frederico and I were alone in that room, which until then had seemed too big for three and too small for two. He slowly turned his face and looked me in the eyes with a different, deeper, unhurried attention. There was no haste in his gesture or his voice. "Come over to my house sometime," he said quietly, "so we can talk better." There was a brief pause. He took a deep breath before continuing, as if deciding to say something he had been keeping to himself for a long time. "After my wife passed away, I was very lonely. Sometimes I miss talking to someone, just talking. I was embarrassed. I felt my face flush, my body stiffen, not knowing what to do with those words that carried more than they appeared to. I nodded, perhaps too quickly, perhaps too little. Before I could respond, I heard the sound of my father returning. Frederico changed the subject immediately, with the naturalness of someone who knows how to hide feelings behind old gestures. He talked about the weather, appointments, trivial things, but something had already been said, and there was no taking it back. It didn't take long for him to say he had to leave. He stood up calmly, said goodbye to my father with a firm handshake, the kind you give to a longtime friend. Then he turned to me. He held out his hand. I took it. The handshake was stronger this time. Longer. He looked me in the eyes, as if he wanted to engrave that moment. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Brian," he said, with a gentle seriousness, and he left. I stood there for a few seconds, still feeling the warmth of that touch on my hand, as if he hadn't completely left. I went up to my room shortly after, closed the door, and lay down on the bed without turning on the light. But it didn't help. His gaze, the words spoken in silence, the invitation that was not just an invitation. Everything spun around in my mind, insistent, like a thought that doesn't ask for permission. There, lying in my childhood bedroom, I realized that a few simple phrases have the power to change a whole night's rest, and perhaps the course of something much bigger. 2 days passed as days do, when something is stuck in your mind, slow on the outside, restless on the inside. I tried to keep myself busy, go out, distract my mind, but Frederico always came back, without asking permission. His gaze, his tone of voice, his restrained way of talking about loneliness. I needed to see him. I needed to talk. I didn't even know why, I just knew I needed to. So I went to my father, pretending not to be interested, as if bringing up the subject out of habit. "Dad," I said, leaning against the doorframe, "I don't remember Frederico very well. Where does he live anyway?" My father smiled, in that simple way of someone revisiting the past. "When you were younger, he lived in another city, son. That's why you don't remember him. He moved here a few years ago. He lives nearby, 2 blocks from here. That big house on the corner with the high walls." I nodded slowly, memorizing every detail, like someone writing down an address they don't want to forget. "Oh, Dad, that's cool," I replied, trying to sound natural. But inside, something had already been decided. That house, those high walls. Now they had meaning, and I knew it wasn't just curiosity that was pulling me in that direction. On the same day, as the afternoon began to fade and the sky turned an old shade of worn blue, I felt that there was no point in putting it off any longer. I took a shower calmly, as if each gesture were a silent preparation. The water running down my body seemed to wash away my uneasiness, but left my decision intact. I put on comfortable, simple clothes, the kind that don't attract attention, as one always does, when one doesn't want to arouse suspicion, either inside or outside the home. I walked slowly down the hall, and found my father and mother sitting in the living room, the television on at a low volume, illuminating their faces tired from the day. "I'm going for a walk," I said in a natural, almost routine tone. My mother nodded, without taking her eyes off the screen. My father muttered something that sounded like, "Go ahead. Nothing special, no questions, no premonitions." I closed the door behind me and felt the night air touch my face. The street was quiet, like the streets of old, when the dark was not frightening, it just invited silence. I began to walk slowly, my steps firm on familiar ground, but my heart following a path I had not yet learned to tread. Each block seemed shorter than the last, and as the night closed in around me, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't just going to meet someone, I was going to meet something that had been waiting for me for a long time. I arrived in front of his house, when the sky had already surrendered to the night. That building with high walls, which during the day had seemed merely imposing, now seemed to hold secrets. I stood still for a few moments, my heart uneasy, almost giving in to the urge to go home and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But there are things that, once awakened, can no longer be forgotten. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Shortly after, the door opened, and Frederico appeared in front of me. He was wearing shorts and a light shirt, a few buttons undone, revealing his chest covered with dark hair, like an old portrait of serene virility. When he saw me, he smiled with a mixture of surprise and joy. "My God, you came," he said, almost laughing with emotion. "Brian, I'm so glad you came. What a pleasant surprise. Come in, please, come in." I walked through the door, feeling the air of the house envelop me. Different, more intimate. We went to the sofa and sat side by side as if it were a natural gesture, as if it had happened before in some life I couldn't remember. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked. "I bought a wine that looks great. I haven't tried it yet. Would you like to have some with me?" "Sure, Mr. Frederico," I replied, half shy, half joking. He smiled, placing his hand on my shoulder with a light, warm touch. "You don't have to call me sir, okay?" I smiled back. "Okay, deal, sir." We both laughed together, and in that laughter there was something old and comfortable, as if we were old friends meeting again after a long time, not yet knowing that that night held much more than simple conversation and shared wine. When he said we should go to the kitchen, it was as if the whole night had conspired to push us closer together. The house was silent, except for the distant sound of the street and the soft clinking of glasses as he poured the wine. We sat in those armchairs in front of the counter, almost face to face, like two men on the verge of a confidence that could no longer be postponed. The wine was smooth, warm in the throat, and the conversation flowed easily, full of pauses that said more than words. At one point, without fanfare, Frederico placed his hand on my thigh. It wasn't a sudden gesture, it was slow, respectful, but laden with intention. "I'm glad you came," he said in a low voice. I felt my face flush. "You're embarrassing me," I replied, almost with a nervous smile. He moved a little closer, and I felt his breath near my mouth, mixed with the aroma of wine and the house. There was something ancient and profound in that moment, as if we were breaking a rule that had never been written but had always been felt. "No need to be nervous," he murmured. Then his lips touched mine. There was no violence or haste, just a meeting of hidden desires. I responded because there was no force in the world capable of holding me back. The kiss was warm, full, and his stubble brushed my face in a way that took my breath away, as if each second erased a little more of who I thought I was. When we pulled apart, he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and tenderness. "I'm sorry, Brian. I couldn't help myself. I've wanted to kiss you since that day at your house." My heart was beating as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. "I haven't stopped thinking about you," I confessed. He smiled, a smile that was sad and beautiful at the same time. "I haven't stopped thinking about you either." And, as if words weren't enough, we kissed again, surrendering to what had been silently woven since that first glance, like an ancient destiny that had finally come to fruition. When the night was already late and the wine had left a gentle warmth in the air, it was time to go. I said goodbye to him at the door, with a smile that said more than any words, and I made my way back home feeling my steps lighter, almost as if I were walking on good memories. The street was quiet, lit by old lampposts, and every meter seemed to confirm what my heart already knew. Crossing those walls, ringing that doorbell, had been a simple gesture and at the same time immense. I felt a serene joy, the kind that makes no noise but stays with you. I returned thinking about the way he looked at me, the shared laughter, the kiss that still seemed to linger on my lips. And as my parents' house came into view in the distance, I realized that certain decisions don't need to be shouted from the rooftops to change your life. They just need to be true. That night, lying in my old bedroom, I felt I had made the right choice. And, as in stories that transcend time, the best decision is not always the safest. It is the one that brings us back to ourselves. The days passed like leaves carried by the wind, and without us realizing it, each other's presence became part of the rhythm of life. We talked every day, sometimes at length, sometimes just a few words, but always with that feeling that something invisible connected us, like an ancient thread that cannot be broken. Until, on one of those silent nights, his message arrived. "Handsome, I can't stand not seeing you anymore. Come here, sleep with me." I read those words with my heart racing, as if each letter had been written directly on my chest. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, not knowing how to respond. There was fear, there was expectation, There was that sweet weight that only important decisions carry. I took a deep breath and opened my heart. I can't take it anymore either. I'm coming. 174, and I went. The night enveloped me on the way, a silent accomplice to that step I took with no turning back. When I arrived at his house, the door opened almost the moment I rang the bell. Frederico was there, waiting for me, as if he already knew I was coming. He said nothing, he just opened his arms and welcomed me into them. The hug was firm, warm, and the kiss that followed needed no words. When the door opened, he was already there, as if waiting for something that the heart recognizes before the body. Frederico pulled me close with firm care, and his arms closed around me like an old shelter. The kiss came without warning, but it wasn't rushed. It was deep, slow, loaded with everything we had kept silent in the days before. Our lips met with a restrained urgency, as if each touch wanted to confirm that this was real. There was warmth, there was tenderness, there was that soft vibration that only arises when two desires walk in the same direction. I felt his stubble lightly brush my face, and it made me shiver, not with haste, but with recognition. It was a kiss that asked for nothing more than presence. A kiss between two men who, after so much silence, finally allowed their hearts to speak. That night we fell asleep in each other's arms, as if we had been sharing that for a lifetime. When I woke up the next morning, the light was streaming softly through the window, as it did in the old days of my youth, and for a moment, I took a while to remember where I was. But it was enough to take a deep breath to feel that something in me had changed. There was a quiet warmth in my chest, a kind of peace that did not come from the rest of the body, but from the meeting of the soul. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and understood without effort. He was the one I wanted by my side, not as a whim of the night, but as someone who recognizes a companion on the journey. Our silences fit together, our gazes understood each other without the need for words, as if we were made of the same time. And although everything had happened quickly, it wasn't haste that moved us. It was the reunion of two mature lives, tired of pretending, that finally allowed themselves to feel. So, almost without realizing it, we let that feeling grow, day after day, with the old serenity of those who know that what is born from the depths does not need to rush to last. But reality, as always, came knocking at the door without asking permission. My vacation was coming to an end, and the days began to weigh differently. The calendar advanced silently, and each dawn brought with it a question I avoided facing. I had built a life in another country. Friends, work, routine, a place I had learned to call my own. All of this existed before Frederico solid, organized, seemingly definitive. And now, there I was, in love, my heart torn between what I had built with effort and what had been born without warning. This discovery left me confused. It wasn't exactly fear, it was dissonance, as if two equally strong truths occupied the same space within me. On one side, the life I had chosen years ago. On the other, a recent but deep feeling that grew with the strength of something too old to be ignored. At night, lying next to him, I felt peace. But when I was alone, the restlessness returned. What to do when your heart points in one direction and your life follows another? How to choose without hurting important parts of who I am? I still had no answers. I only knew that time, once again, had placed me at a crossroads, one of those that don't appear on maps, but change the entire course of a story. And so, between suitcases almost packed and feelings still unresolved, my story with Frederico was left hanging in the air, like those old letters that are never sent. I walked around my parents' house feeling the weight of the goodbyes that had not yet happened, not to the city, not to him, not to who I was becoming. Nothing was decided. There was love, there was fear, there were paths that crossed without asking permission. And for the first time I realized that growing up is not about choosing the easy way, but accepting doubt when the heart has already chosen before reason. On that last night, under the familiar sky of my childhood, I understood that some stories don't end, they just wait for the right time, like seeds stored in ancient soil, to find out what happened next, whether I left or stayed, whether that love took root or turned into longing. Sign up to follow part 2. And for those looking for the full version, without veils or cuts, the uncensored story is pinned in the comments.